In this video we are going to take a closer look at the options left for Deathwatch outside of their Army of Renown, the Kill Team Strike Force. Over the course of the video, we will first take a look at why Space Marines are struggling and how the Army of Renown is still bringing home decent results. In the second part, we will then go through a few advantages of playing a regular Deathwatch army list, before concluding the video with a quick wrap-up.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer, and I will be guiding you through this video.
Having dominated the late stages of 8th edition with the second release of their codex, Space Marines have certainly been on a downward spiral in 9th edition. Does anyone still remember the community uproar over Eradicators with their Indomitus box release? To us Space Marine players, it certainly feels like a distant memory at best. So much has happened since then. Months of Drukhari domination, pre-nerf AdMech, the current overperformance of Custodes and Tau, Harlequins on the rise, and Tyranid previews and leaks appear to fit right into the latest 9th edition power creep. How much the game has changed when even the power-armored Space Marine profile with 2 wounds suddenly does not seem that impressive anymore, yet still has a hefty price tag attached. While we patiently waited for chapter approved 2022 points decreases, the average competitive Space Marine list now costs more than ever. Furthermore, while Necrons, the other faction having received their codex early, has been boosted through a balanced data slate, Space Marines got a big round of nothing and are now the faction with the oldest 9th edition codex and poor win rates to match it. While Deathwatch has been relatively fortunate among a struggling faction, one of our core elements are the kill teams, and ultimately they will to a large part always be as good as the Space Marine datasheets contained within. So how does our Army of Renown manage to still stay somewhat competitive? I don't know about you guys, but back when the Kill Team Strike Force freshly came out, it did not seem obvious to me that it would be good, and I certainly did not take it for granted that it would become our new competitive meta. Just like with the Deathwatch supplement itself, there is a lot of complexity to it and it needs some time to fully sink in. Warzone Octarius Book 1 got released back in October last year, and from a competitive perspective, around January, the Army of Renown list started to overtake the Dreadnought spam, and it wasn't until February that they fully dominated the competitive scene. Chapter approved 2022 certainly helped with that though. Speaking of which, personally, if I had to nail it down to 3 main points, I would say that it's number 1 the focus on kill teams, which are troops, and now more desired than ever in chapter approved 2022. Number 2 the access to different chapter tactics, including protection against mortal wounds or advance and charge, and number 3 the omnipotent Specialism Extremis stratagem, allowing us to delete pretty much anything. For more information on our Army of Renown and its tournament results, feel free to check out my previous coverage linked in the description. Now, with such a strong Army of Renown, is there even a point playing something else? From a purely competitive perspective, I think that if you wanted to get the absolute most out of Deathwatch at this point, it would indeed be the Army of Renown. Having said that, I also think that there are several good reasons to play something else regardless of that. Here are my personal top 3 that I can think of. First and perhaps most importantly, while it might be tempting to build lists according to the most successful tournament results, I think the average player has to consider how much that applies to their personal environment, their local meta, as it is more commonly referred to. In the past, I have done an entire video on the pros and cons of copy-pasting the most recent meta lists. Link to that is in the description. In short, not everyone is a tournament player and has the time and resources to follow the fast pace of 9th edition. If you are playing primarily with friends with a similar mindset, I think you will end up with a far wider range of list types that will work out just fine. This doesn't even necessarily mean underperforming datasheets. The list might just end up having less synergy than, let's say, Michael Costello's take on our Army of Renown. The second is overall Deathwatch complexity, especially from a beginner's perspective. The 9th edition Deathwatch supplement is a complex one, and there are a lot of things to keep track of. The Army of Renown is adding even more layers to that. If you are relatively new to the game and/or Deathwatch, it might be overwhelming to start directly with the Army of Renown. While I always encourage the use of cheat sheets and whatnot, even that might not be enough. Nothing lost by starting small, perhaps even with regular units over kill teams, and then slowly working your way up as you get more reps in. From a beginner's perspective, I would also add that it might feel more rewarding to just include a few cool datasheets that are fun models, rather than the most competitive picks there is. Then as a third and final one, I would argue that perhaps now is the perfect time to experiment a little with both strong new codex releases and underperforming Space Marines. Let's say Space Marines were the top dogs and Deathwatch had the one best list that can easily win tournaments. Would you really want to experiment at that point over just bringing home a relatively safe victory? Ties into the first point about the local meta, but at least as far as I'm concerned, I would make sure to bring such a winning list to any event I'd be playing. Now, back to reality, seeing that other factions are currently dominating, there is less lost by just trying something new. Who knows, maybe a more exotic list will even catch some people off guard. Having said all that, let's have a more practical look at some of the advantages of running a regular list over the Army of Renown. The top one I can think of would be paying less of the so-called taxes. What I'm thinking here are both the mandatory specialisms as well as the kill team default troop tax. For the latter, both intercessors and heavy intercessors in particular come to mind. While they do have their place in kill teams, and even the specialisms have turned out to be not as bad as expected in practice, the added flexibility of just including a minimum unit of Inquisitors, or 5 Eradicators, or even Hellblasters on their own is certainly worth considering. Furthermore, there are the cheap utility picks like Eliminators or Suppressors, which work just fine as their own squads. I have done dedicated videos for these too, links are in the description. And speaking of cheap utility picks, let's not forget about my all-time favorites, the company veterans, with their amazing bodyguard rule. Too good not to abuse while it still lasts. Another thing that the Army of Renown is lacking is indirect fire. The Whirlwind or Sicaran Arcus come to mind. The former is a particularly good source for fight last through its unique stratagem, something that the Army of Renown can only get with a Judiciar, which will be hard to include due to a general points shortage in those kinds of lists. Space Marine datasheets aside, I think Assassins or even Inquisitor are worth considering, though perhaps the latter a bit more on the fluffy side of things. In the near future, I plan to cover both Assassins and Inquisitors in more detail. Let me know in the comments if this is something that would be of interest, and or if you have any specific questions or topics that you would like me to cover for these. All in all, while times may be tough for Space Marines, Deathwatch included, I personally think that it's well worth hanging in there with the watch and perhaps using the opportunity to experiment with new builds again. Having said that, if I were to attend an event where I wanted to get the max out of Deathwatch, I would bring the Army of Renown. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have briefly looked at why things are bleak for Space Marines at this point, basically a combination of an old mediocre 9th edition codex that saw primarily nerfs, while later releases heavily profited from codex creep. While Deathwatch had a comparably strong, though complex, supplement to begin with, the Army of Renown turned out to be strong enough to keep them somewhat afloat for the time being. While the Kill Team Strike Force is unquestionably the most competitive way to play Deathwatch at this point, the tournament results of the last 2 months are more than proof enough. I think that there are still good reasons to pick a regular list instead. I went into my top 3 reasons, which are less taxes, more beginner friendly, as well as now being the perfect time to experiment. Personally, even though I am very fond of our Army of Renown, I miss bringing some of my favorite utility picks like the company veterans, Eliminator or Suppressor squads, or just having more overall flexibility with datasheets. Hell, points increases or not, bringing a Dreadnought or 2 is still a great addition to a Deathwatch list as far as I'm concerned. Space Marines aside, both Assassins and Inquisitors can also be interesting additions, more about that in a future video though. So that's it for my take on playing a list outside of our amazing Army of Renown. Are you guys sticking with Deathwatch? And what kinds of lists have you been playing lately? Will something good happen to Space Marines anytime soon? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.